Scottish Government 2015 acknowledged that key areas of policy such as the economy, transport, education and health can have a particular impact in rural communities and seeks to reflect this in mainstream policy document. But we have little current research in Scotland in relation to what impacts on developing quality learning and teaching in rural schools. My name is Anne Paterson. I've been involved in rural education for all my career and I've attended a rural school, as have my own children. And as part of my master's research in 2018, my main focus was in remote and rural education. From the work undertaken, I had the opportunity to present at the International Symposium for Innovation in Rural Education in 2018 at Montana State University. This opportunity to network with rural researchers and to explore rural education further prompted me to undertake my Doctor of Education part-time, which I began at Strathclyde University in October 2018. My interest in rural education comes from a rich practical point of view and has made me reflect on the questions of my own objectivity as a researcher, and has therefore led me to embrace this knowledge and to explore the topic through an autoethnographic approach. In this lightning talk, I want to explore the initial research data that I undertook with newly qualified teachers and how this has really stimulated my further curiosity around rural education and how we ensure we have quality learning and teaching, and also to introduce my current research project based on ethnographic methodology. The initial research was carried out in session 2017-18 with a group of newly qualified teachers. There was 29 in total, and I wanted to look at how they became highly effective teachers within a rural education setting. To undertake this, it was explored by reviewing their own developing teacher agency, and the structured approach of the inquiry focused on the impact of the previous life histories, their current placement, and the future views of how they affected the decision if they would come and work and commit to a career in rural schools. The method I used was based on the work from Priestley, Robinson and Pista in 2015. It was based around their ecological model for teacher agency. Teacher's agency begins in the past, in the iterational stage, where the life histories and the professional histories are brought into the here and now, into the practical evaluative stage. But also in the practical evaluative stage, there's the addition of what's happening around our developing teachers, the cultural ideas, the structural, and the material. And it's only ever in the practical evaluative, in the here and now, where the teacher's agency can actually be seen. It's also influenced by the future, the projective phase, where that's the short-term projective of maybe next week, a year, a month, and the long term, what's the future? I wanted to look at those three stages and to use that in developing where the teacher agency was for our newly qualified teachers in the rural context. The local authority where I am Chief Education Officer is Argyll and Bute. Argyll and Bute is a very rural and remote area in Scotland, and across the local authority the schools are mainly rural schools. Some are very remote rural schools, and the classification for these is taken from the Scottish Government's Urban Rural Classification, which determines how a school is viewed in the remote and rural capacity. The local authority where I am Chief Education Officer and where the newly qualified teachers were placed is Argyll and Bute. Argyll and Bute is a very remote and rural part of Scotland and has many schools that are classified as very remote and rural. In fact, there are almost 40% of the schools in Argyll and Bute as very remote and rural. This is against the percentage in Scotland of 2.9%. Therefore, it was really important to understand the place where where the newly qualified teachers would be taking up their first posts. I had met with the newly qualified teachers several times at their induction programme meetings, and in November I had worked with them through a concept triad map to collect data around their thoughts on where they were as a developing teacher. This was to be taken as part of the teacher agency framework as previously described. And in the triad map, they could record their iterational, what they had brought from the previous, from the background, into the practical evaluative, how they were getting on at this precise time and their teacher development, and what they saw as the future work. These triad maps were then collated together and information taken from them as part of a theme or a metaphor or a plot line to look at the importance of what was developing through each of these stages to ensure that their own teacher agency was developing as a rural teacher. The themes that developed were then explored. In the life history section, the traditional section, there were three clear themes coming through: of limited or no knowledge of a rural school, that their own children had attended a rural school, or that in fact they themselves had a rural background and attended a rural school. When we moved into the practical evaluative stage, the here and now, the strongest factor coming through that was developing their own teacher agency was the colleagues and support in the rural school situation, along with the probationer networking that had been set up with a focus on the rural context. There was very little CPD was available online for the rural context. However, there was in the clusters of the rural schools coming together. The projective phase of looking at what would support their teacher development as a rural teacher again showed that what was coming through strongly was the rural environment, that place, and the opportunity of getting to know what was important for that rural context and that rural school. In addition to that, there was the factor that many of the newly qualified teachers had actually belonged to the area and wanted to stay close to home for their environment and their working phase. What was coming through very clearly was that theme of the importance of place and how that developed the rural context, the rural educator. In discussion with the newly qualified teachers, place became an important factor. It was a strong factor on how their own developing teacher agency was progressing. The positives around the community, the staff and parents who were there and supportive of the new teacher was a real plus point. However, there were the significant difficulties that arose of working in sometimes very isolated positions with lack of peer support and also the lack of anonymity, which caused some of the newly qualified teachers quite a lot of concern in their own lives. Corbett in 2015 has really said that geography and place is an important aspect of the rural teacher education. And on the journey around teacher education and development, the place impacts on the practices that are undertaken. This was an area that I felt was very important and had really wanted to look more deeply into, was to the impact of the context and the place, and the fact that a rural school is very different from an urban school. There were more questions than answers in my mind when I had finished this first part of the inquiry. In 2019, the OECD published a paper around learning in rural schools. The materials in this paper supported very much my views around the place being important, especially in the sections around the teacher preparation, learning and support, and school leadership. This therefore gave me further information to go forward and to look at the importance of place in developing our rural teachers. The research bug has really hit me, and moving forward into the doctorate for education, I was very keen to continue and explore rural education. From the work I had undertaken and from the gap in resources for research in Scotland, I was keen to look further into what affected our rural context in schools. There are three clear themes coming through at present around place, leadership, and the teachers who are involved in the actual delivery of the education in our rural context. The importance of place is an area that I am looking at just now, and looking at how policy, national policy in Scotland is actually affected in the situation of a rural context. Leadership, again looking at what pedagogical constructs there are that allow the leaders to actually be leaders in a rural context. And how do our teachers actually develop their own sense of teacher agency in that rural context? In our rural schools, there's a complicated relationship between local and national implementation of policy. The rural school is often at the heart of its community and has high community expectations. How can the national policy be implemented within these rural schools along with the expectations of community and the layer of local authority? I am really interested to see and to research on how this is developing, in particular in two very small rural schools, where they are very much at the heart of the community. I intend to be looking at the national policy and to see it enacted in those schools, and to how this is effective on a national stage and on a local stage. Place is a critical pedagogy for education, and schools are embedded in their communities. That powerful relationship of place, people, and policy is something that I am really intrigued with looking at deeper, and how that really impacts on the delivery of education in our rural context. My research to date has really indicated that place and relationships impact on the pedagogical approaches in rural schools. However, our national context and national policy does not always follow that the relationship of pedagogical approaches can be different in rural schools. There is a question there to be researched about how much importance is given to the relationship of place and the cultural context within pedagogical construct. Would a more place-based pedagogical construct realise the vision and ambition for our rural schools? Or is it the same across a national stage? This is an area I'm really keen to investigate, and to look at how we can ensure that we do have a national standard in Scotland, but still taking on board the importance of the places and the construct that has around educational development. There is a research gap in Scottish rural education. There is very little up-to-date research that has taken place, and in an area of Scotland where there is a huge landmass that is rural and a percentage of schools that are rural, this is actually very disappointing. I have found that in Australia and Canada and America, there is much more research is taking place into rural education. They have centres set up for rural education. And in fact, Kelly, Fogarty and Roberts in 2015 demonstrated that there requires to be a model for improving the attraction and retention of teachers in rural and remote Australia. And that focuses on areas of professional development, rural difference, economic recognition, and teachers' own development, personal development areas. We do not have this kind of information in Scotland, and it is important for improving rural education to really understand the importance of place, to understand the importance of the development of our rural teachers and the outcomes that makes for our young people. My research area will help towards some of this new developing work that I hope that others will be able to be inspired and go forward with as well. Thank you for listening to this lightning talk, and thank you for your interest in rural education. It's an area I'm passionate about. It's an area that I want to ensure that I have contributed towards the development further of our rural education in Scotland. I'd be really pleased to hear from anybody who has some discussion points or some views that may help and inform my further development of this subject. Thank you.